Hello, beautiful light-filled souls. Today's guest is Reverend Dr. Seth Daniel Jones, a theologian, former pastor, and author whose journey has taken him from ministry in Maine and Montana to the depths of mystical experience as a participant in the Johns Hopkins Psilocybin study. Seth underwent two transformative sessions that really opened him to a deeper understanding of the spiritual realm. These encounters inspired his doctoral work at the Portland Seminary, where he earned a doctorate of ministry, focused on extraordinary spiritual experiences. He's now writing The Shimmering Cathedral, a book exploring how these powerful moments help us make meaning and connect more fully to the sacred. So we talked about this and near-death experiences and more. So let's just dive in. So Seth, I was reminded of your story. I learned about you through Peter Panagora, who I've interviewed on this channel. And I just happened to come across the article, "This is Your Priest on Drugs" in the New Yorker. And I was like, oh, I was going to interview Peter's friend, Seth
Yeah,
Jones. And so tell me a little bit about that article, because that's, some national attention. And I'm sure some of the people in the article as well.
sure. So the article itself, I actually was not interviewed for that one. I was interviewed for a couple others that I think are coming out soon. Um, but Hunt Priest is a friend of mine, and Hunt and I, uh, back in 2020, the fall of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, and right after Brian Muir Rescue's book, The Immortality Key, came out, I contacted Brian Muir Rescue and said, hey, I was in this crazy study with Johns Hopkins. And if anyone from that study contacts you, here's my information as well. And so Brian and I had several conversations. I consider him a friend. And he and Hunt contacted him. And that's how he and Hunt and I hooked up. And then from there, it just kind of blossomed, and we began to sort of pull in people. Finally, in 2022, 20 of us out of the 24 who went through the study were able to get together. And so, which was really great. And which also I would just point out, this is something I kind of wish Michael Pollan would have highlighted, and that's how unusual it is for a study to, especially when it's individuals going through the study, the vast majority of studies, no one knows anyone who's going through it. And this one, we were all able to connect. The people in the article, I mean, he talked about Zach Kamenetz, who runs Shefa, who's the sort of the Jewish psychedelic group. Hunt runs Ligare, which is the Christian psychedelic group. And then he also interviewed Sugra, who's a wonderful woman who lives over in London and sometimes in the United States, who is starting a Muslim psychedelic group. So just this really nice sort of integration of at least the monotheistic approaches to faith. So, I think what Michael did, he's always been at the forefront of psychedelics, and has the wherewithal to start foundations and financial support for these things.
If you could just tell us about the Johns Hopkins study, and I think you had never taken a drug before,
Right.
like not in your consciousness, and
Yeah.
I'd love to hear how it changed you, if any,
Mhm.
after effects.
So part of the requirement to be in the study was that you had to be, for lack of a better way of putting it, a psychedelic virgin. And so, you know, we so they didn't want anyone with any experience. That was true for me. I'm a Gen Xer, child of the 70s and 80s, where, the war on drugs and, you know, all the stuff we were fed about how horrible these things are. I bought into a lot of that. And so in even afterwards, I'm a pretty clean person. I don't really do much at all except maybe have some wine once in a while. And so, um, but going into the study, I actually kind of feel like I had to argue my way into it because I was initially accepted, and then they bring you down to Johns Hopkins for an initial sort of psychological profile, super intensive psychological profile done by the wonderful Mary Casamano, who is she's the social worker for the Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Lab, and truly a wonderful woman. And then there's the medical profile. You do a full medical workup, and I didn't clear the workup because my blood pressure. I have a thing about hospitals and doctors and things, and my blood pressure was through the roof when I went down there, and they were like, "You can't be in the study with a blood pressure that high." I was like, "Well, what if I can get it down?" They're like, "Oh, well, so they said, well, we'll consider it if you can get it down." And so then I spent like 4 months working on getting my blood pressure down and ended up on blood pressure meds and all kinds of crazy stuff. And so I was finally able to get into the study. And they were very deliberate, I would say. Each participant was assigned 2 guides. And so I met with my guides for at least uh, a total of probably 8 to 10 hours before I went through the first session. And once you get down there for the first session, I met with the guides the day before, and then the day of, uh, you go in. They have this nicely decorated room with a soft sofa and lights, and they present you with the psilocybin, which is medical grade psilocybin, like distilled, and that's all. It's just pure psilocybin, and it's in a blue pill. I think that's important. Not a red pill; it's a blue pill, and they present it to you in this nice little clay cup. There's kind of a little ritual around it, and Roland Griffiths, rest his soul, came in and talked with me a little bit before I took it, and he's there for each session when somebody takes it. And so he was funny. He explained to me. He said, "Here's what we know about what happens," and he talked a little bit about serotonin receptors, and then he said, and then uh, the the substance takes effect, and we don't know what's going on. We don't know what happens, and so uh, and it took about 20 minutes for in that first session, and I had no expectations. I didn't really know what to expect other than having a sort of general fascination of um, wild drug experiences throughout the course of my life, and so I'd read up a lot about a lot of these things, and but had no experience, so I really didn't know what to expect. And so about 20 minutes in, I started feeling things, and they have you lay down at that point, and they put on eye covers and headphones. There's a musical track basically that goes along with your experience, and which you can find on Spotify or YouTube music as well, the Johns Hopkins psychedelic music. And um, and then they just kind of, you see what happens after that. And for me, my first, it's 2 sessions, and my first session um, was quite powerful. Both of them were very powerful, but my first one, uh, I had, I went through what they call the ego death, and I was led down this sort of obsidian stairway by this being. I guess I don't know if I'd call it an angelic being or not, but it stood next to me. I couldn't tell if they were male or female. and nor could I discern a face, but it was this very gentle presence who led me down this obsidian stairway. And about halfway down the stairway, it was like the entire universe just sort of flashed up into this shimmering cathedral. And I had this awareness that everything was surrounded and supported by beauty. And probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And uh, it was like like hovered just behind like sort of the veil of our perception. And the bricks were these multi-dimensional shimmering bricks that covered the color spectrum plus some colors that I was not able to identify, and which I thought was really interesting and amazing. Um, I call it a cathedral. It could have just as easily been a Tibetan temple or a mosque. It just had that sort of deeply holy sense to it, I guess you'd say. And and as I was going down these stairs, I was also experiencing an incredible amount of grief for all the people in my time as a pastor that had died and that I hadn't had a chance to grieve for, and all the personal losses in my life and that kind of thing. And so while I was surrounded by all this beauty, I was crying, and there was this sense that I was dying. And I had as we got to the bottom, this being laid me down in this, I don't know what to call it. It wasn't a coffin, and it was like this sort of transparent. The only thing I can think of it is call it as a transport device, or like some kind of, but I had to lay down in it, and then he shut a cover. And I essentially went through an ego death at that point. And when I came out on the other side, I was crying, and I was met by this woman who I was very close friends with, who had died of lung cancer. And she met me on the other side and told me to stop crying. She was a funny person. She was like, just stop crying and follow me. Come with me. And so I got up and followed her, and she took me through like the under parts of this cathedral, and so the bricks and like little alcoves and things. And then we walked up a stairway and came out onto a cobblestone street in Paris, and it was beautiful. It was nighttime, and there were still lights up from Christmas, and there were chairs on tables at the cafes, and she just kind of went, "This is pretty much where I hang out now, Paris at night." And I said, "So are you telling me that that heaven is Paris at night?" And she said, "Pretty much. That's what it is." And so way in the back, my ego was like way up and to the right and kind of watching all this. And I had this thought way back there, does this mean I'm going to have to learn French now? So, so, and
Medium, I would say that's her experience.
Yes, exactly. Probably. And so it was lovely and beautiful, and I came out of it sort of overwhelmed by how beautiful everything is and was, including people and all the creatures. And my friend Jean used to say, life for me has become a party that I never want to leave. And I thought that was such a beautiful way to put it. When she was alive, she used to say that. And um, she always wanted to be the last person to leave the party. So, and so it was just this incredibly beautiful experience. And I had the sense as I was talking with my guides about beauty, and I kind of went on this sort of verbal uh, deep dive about the nature of beauty. And, you know, I think it was intelligent. It sounded very intelligent to me, the reflections about beauty. But I had this sense of a message that I was sort of left with by the experience, like a revelation that um, beauty, the way it came to me is that beauty is leaving the earth, and beauty needs curators, people to remember the beautiful, so that generations following don't forget. And so essentially becoming a, you know, a collector of beautiful things. And I found that to be a really powerful I, calling, a potential vocation, one that I took and still do take very seriously, but feel like uh, not only have I failed at it, I've taken turns that have led me away from it over the past few years, you know, and
Well, tell me what you think, how you interpreted that. So what is,
yeah,
I look at nature as beautiful, and the more we
hmm,
take over nature, the more we
yeah,
take over empathy and kindness, the more we,
absolutely.
see those things are beautiful. But how do you interpret it? Because you were there in that moment.
Yeah. And I would affirm that the nature definitely, um, and just sort of doing what I can to be in it, to recognize the beauty that's present there, and also just committing to being a source of beautiful things. So writing and music, um, trying to find stories that are have a beautiful, something beautiful within them. And and to be clear, when I say beauty, it is not at the expense of sadness, fear, troubles, and difficulties. I think beauty can rise up within those things,
Yeah.
and part of what I felt my work is and was is to try to discern what's beautiful in those things.
And
And
is there
so,
this soul beauty too? Like I have this image is coming to me of I taught junior high, and this young
mm-hmm.
girl with Down syndrome would come in every day with a flower or a poem,
Oh,
say, "I
yeah,
love you, Miss Barker," and hug me. And I was like,
yeah,
to me, she's the most beautiful girl in the world. She was bullied
right, yeah,
by a Miss Teen America. And so,
mm-hmm.
like, I sat down with those girls, and they had detention with me, and
Yeah,
explained to them what soul beauty is and what depth
mm-hmm.
is and how
Yeah.
beautiful this young girl is.
Well, that's lovely. That's really nice. Exactly that kind of thing. And art, you know, wherever I can find it. And um, so that's how I interpret it. That's kind of how I understand it. And you know, I think you know, there's the desires we have to enact those things, and then there's what life is bringing us that can make it really hard to make that. You know, our world is not built to support the beautiful, you know, and
That is true. There, especially in places where work is valued at such a high level that
mhm,
if you're not working like a machine all the time, then something's wrong
right.
with you. Then
Yeah, 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 and right.
we cannot give ourselves to the machine, and we cannot become like machines.
That's right. Absolutely. And so that was sort of the big message that I got from my experience. And you know, and as it was going on, you know, there were these moments where it was a highly synesthetic experience as well. I could see music, you know, I heard colors, seeing the music though was really amazing. And oh, and the cathedral had, as I was listening to the music after I talked and sort of went on my verbal ramble with my guides, I lay back down and was just listening to what's his name? Russell Paul, I think is his name, who has these beautiful pieces. And I think he's a flute player. And there's a piece of him playing the flute in the Sophia Hagia in Turkey. And so it echoes. And so I could see it, but I could also see there were crows up in the rafters, and they were like messengers. And so they would transmit things across the vast cathedral. And so there was a month between them. And so in between that time, I met with my guides twice, I think, in that before the second experience. So by the time you get to the first experience, they know you well, and by the time you get to the second one, they know you really well. And so my second experience, they upped the dose by they determine it by weight. And so my first experience probably worked out to something close to 4.85 grams, which is a very high dose of psychedelics. And then the second one, they go up more. And
so a
so
dose, as they say.
Right. And and before I go into that, I just want to recognize that you are, your podcast focuses on a lot of things, but primarily near-death experiences. And so I'm very aware of that there's a significant overlap experientially with a lot of psychedelic experiences and near-death experiences as well. And so Peter Panagore and I have talked about that. And when I've talked to him, he's like, "Oh yeah, I saw that. I remember that." And so I just want to acknowledge that as we go along here. And yeah, my second experience was off the chain wild. And I like to say that my first experience rewired my brain, and my second experience restructured my psyche. And so I felt like it was moving like blocks of my person and personality and psyche out and putting them in other places, and like, just moving things all around. And it was challenging, as they like to say. And if I were on the street and I'd had a similar experience to my second experience, I might have classified it as a bad trip, and they don't like that language at Johns Hopkins. They keep it with challenging, and they don't want to lay a judgment on it. But I think there's some value to letting people call it what they think it is. So it wasn't all terrible. I got a lot out of it. It's just it was wild, and it started out almost immediately. Within 15 minutes, I felt like I was in a tunnel of tentacles, and so it was awful, and I couldn't get comfortable. I felt like my clothes, grated against my skin, and then so I took my outer shirt off. It was winter, so and then my bare skin with the air felt like it was being rubbed raw by the air. And so it didn't matter if I had clothes on or off.
I understand. At a party in college when a guy was tripping and took all his clothes off.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's probably why. And I feel for him. And it was so strange. One of my hands was sweaty and the other was dry. I couldn't tell if I was hot or cold. I felt like my body couldn't find where it was in space, and it was so strange. And that just kind of got worse and worse, where to the point where I began to panic and felt like I have allergies and I'm allergic to things. And, I've had some pretty serious allergic reactions in the past. And I thought I was having an allergic reaction to the psilocybin. And Bill was like, you can't, this is not a thing you have an allergic reaction to. And I was like, okay, all right. And furthermore, he said, your blood pressure right now is the lowest it's been the entire time we've been with you in both of these experiences. And so my perception and what my body was doing was completely divergent. And I felt like I was dying. And I was like, oh, I was making plans in my head. I was like, okay, the hospital's right next door. They can get me there, and if I die, then, this is, they'll be able to contact people. And I was all set, like, I was all set mentally and in terms of my ego to die. But my body was like, no, we're not doing that. And it was just in this complete reaction, which was really interesting because reflecting on it, it made me very aware that a lot of what we perceive as control over the body, a lot of you know wellness influencers and that kind of thing, just there's so much. The body has a mind of its own. It's going to do what it's going to do, and there's only so much we can do with our minds with regards to the body. It's its own thing, and we kind of rest in this, you know, you know, and anyway, so it was incredibly difficult. I was breathing heavy, I was moving around, and as it got worse, I felt like I was being crushed in this concrete, like angular space, and until it just flashed out, and I ended up in the I ended up in the sky looking down on this uh, Mayan or maybe Aztec um, ground village, when it was where they would play the game where they threw the ball. I was looking on one of those fields. There was a village beyond it and some pyramids, and I had lightning shooting out of my hands and my feet, and I realized, um, I was some sort of war god. All I knew was rage and anger, and it was just this. It was very powerful, and I was thrashing around, breathing heavy, and that I don't know how long these things went on for. My guess is probably at least an hour and a half, maybe more, that I was thrashing around and doing all this. And that went on for a little while, and it shifted, and I became a bull in a Colosseum, in the dungeon of a Colosseum way back in ancient Greece, maybe in Corinth or something, I don't know. And I was slamming against the bars of knowing I was going to be sent up into this thing to die. And so now the anger was not pure, it was also tinged with fear. And that went on for a while. And then just as suddenly as the shift to the God, I became this sort of spiral of smoke and became, I think, an aspect of Vishnu, maybe, or Shiva. And I was moving these globes in this vast space around, and it wasn't even the attention was just the relationship of these globes to one another. It wasn't even about beauty. It was just very almost mechanical. And it was so bizarre. And at any one of those points, whether the Aztec god, the bull, or the aspect of Shiva, if you had asked me who I was, I am not sure I would have been able to answer. I don't think I would have had access to my personal history and knowledge.
Hmm.
And then I think I blacked out. I because everything just went dark, and then I like snapped awake, and I was looking at my guides, and I said, "What happened? What did you do to me?" Is what I said, and I didn't know if I'd been dreaming it or if I'd actually been moving around. And they said, "No, you were moving around and you were thrashing around. My hair was a mess. The place was a mess. And man, I hurt. I was so sore. And
Wow.
yeah, it was very embodied. And then we talked for a while. I talked about rage and anger and all these things. And the funny thing about that whole conversation, I mean, if I really concentrate, I can remember some of the things we talked about. But I remember that conversation as a particular color of green, like a mint green, that I really haven't seen anywhere in the world yet. Some things have come close, and I'm like, oh, I know that color. I know what that's
Hmm.
telling me. It's such a strange way to remember something as a color, and it was so bizarre. And and then I just kind of relaxed, listened to music, and tried to relax, I guess. Um, but that was about the craziest thing I've ever encountered or experienced, and it was even a little off the radar from other experiences. I mean, I remember Roland telling me only one other person in his entire time doing this since the year 2000 had actually become an animal. So, and that
Yeah,
surprised me. I thought more people would have access to that, so
what's
um
interesting is only one near-death experiencer I've interviewed believed she was a whale in another life
oh, interesting.
and
How,
was kind of given that information in her near-death experience. So,
yeah, what
um,
an interesting thing to come to know. Huh.
so how did this change you? I know you
Hmm.
had spiritual experiences before this. How did
Yeah.
it change your view of spiritual experience?
So the first thing I would say is I have a sense um that psychedelics have this sort of capacity to uh, push things from uh, you know from sort of wondering to knowing. And so, in terms of reflecting on my past spiritual experiences before this, I used to think to myself, oh, could have been my brain, misfiring, or, maybe my allergies were active and I had this experience. And, you know, I always sort of held it in kind of a questionable space. After my psychedelic experiences, all those experiences sort of moved into the category of a kind of knowing, oh no, these things actually happened, and they were transmitting some sort of information to me, and I find that interesting. And I've heard that move from like just sort of questionable reflection on the experience to a knowing from others as well, and not just in this study but others I've talked to. And I suspect it's probably similar in near-death experiences too, that you sort of go into this knowing space rather than, yeah, I mean, you know
Definitely.
Yeah, and I find that really interesting. I'm not sure what to make of it necessarily. I One of the other things that came out of my experiences, this is after I went through in December of 2018 and January of 2019. So we're almost 6 years out now. 6 years out, and since that time, over the course of the past 2.5 years, I would say I've begun to take seriously the idea of holding beliefs and thoughts lightly rather than um, being strident and assertive, and just trying to hold all things in this sort of lightness of being, I guess I'd call it. And
Oh, it's more of
you
an
know,
angelic perspective. I mean, when I connect with angels, that's how they see us. Like they don't see, quote, a narcissist. They see a grown person acting like a child and they just want to
oh,
send that person love, oh, it's little, angry child.
that's very sweet. I like that.
And really, maybe indigenous cultures heal people of mental illnesses because isn't that what a narcissist wants? Is a lot of love and attention. If they were
Yeah,
showered with love, could that help them heal some? And
right, right. It
yeah.
probably does. I'm sure it
Well,
does.
well,
Um,
I have a
so
question.
anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
I read that you grew up studying St. Francis and Mary and the
Hmm.
Gnostics, and that you were kind of drawn to the strange and unusual. Does that
Yes.
make more sense now that you've had this experience, or do you feel like, oh, maybe I was connecting with St. Francis? Or
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a six of one, half dozen of another, or a cat chasing its tail kind of thing. I, I've always had a fascination with the unusual and the strange and the bizarre. And my grandmother believed I was psychic. And so whenever she would visit, she would bring those ESP cards, with like the star and the circle and the wavy lines and the square. And she would practice with me. I can't remember how I did, but I always thought it was interesting. And it was my grandmother, so I took the I took her seriously with that. And I also had unusual experiences as a kid, and I'd go in and talk to my minister at the church, and he was very, very what do I want to say, sympathetic. He listened well and responded well. And so um coming into adulthood, I was always attracted to unusual stories, and St. Francis stands out to me just because he was a playboy when he was a kid, and when he was a teenager, and then he had this incredible experience, and kind of had the I mean, just sort of on a there's a lot of stories, and it's hard to discern this. I don't think it's worthwhile to try to figure out which are stories and what's true and what's not. I don't think that's important in this in all of this necessarily. For St. Francis, he basically saw Christ in a leper who was outside of the city of Assisi, and realized that he was being led to serve them and serve uh, the church, such as it is, um, in a similar way, to become this healing presence. And he went all in, and I, 1200, right after the Black Death and everything, here's this guy who's like, yeah, let's just throw all that away and just focus on what's really important here, which is healing, love, care, other people. And he did it. And and he had these continual extraordinary spiritual experiences throughout his life. And particularly at the end, he had the stigmata of Christ, the wounds of Christ. And he wasn't able to accept it. And he didn't know how to make meaning of it because he didn't think he deserved it. And so I just found it to be a really compelling, beautiful story. So I did a lot of work around that when I was first in seminary. I also studied visionary experiences of the Virgin Mary showing up to people, and the Gnostics were interesting to me, in part because they made space for these extraordinary spiritual experiences. And I want to be real, as someone who's studied the Gnostics, I just want to be clear. A lot of people love the Gnostics. I can say without reservation, they would be even more fundamentalist than some of the fundamentalists we have today. They were extremists of the first sort, and often because they had this very clear division between the body and the spirit is trapped in the body. We're basically held prisoner here, and Christ is the example that we follow. He's like sort of this thin blue thread from here to the release of the spirit from this prison of materiality. And so I know that's not how a lot of people understand the Gnostics, but that's if you understand that they're trying to escape a lot of the complexities of their systems of thought back in the early centuries, make a lot of sense, because it's a labyrinth to get out. So,
and honestly, there's a lot of people in pain here who look at the
yeah.
existence that way. And as near-death experiencers, sometimes we have this loneliness for the other side. But I do remind people that bringing heaven to earth, or recognizing beauty here, is an important part of using those extraordinary spiritual experiences for the transformation of the world around us. And I know your work, if you don't mind talking a little bit about your work in your book about, I think, personal transformation and extraordinary spiritual experiences and the structure and anatomy of them. You've gone deep with it.
I have. And Christianity, this is probably true in most religions of the world and spiritualities. Almost all of them are built on an extraordinary spiritual experience. Christianity, which is my tradition, the whole thing is built around the resurrection. What's a resurrection? It's bizarre, and it's a really strange experience. It's not just the dead coming to life. It's more than that. And we really don't know what it is. All I know is from the stories is it looks like somebody who's fully integrated their spiritual connection with their bodily experience, and you can no longer separate them. And as a result, it transforms everything. And so my first point is just, recognizing that when we commit to a path, a religious path or a spiritual path, we're also committing to the extraordinary spiritual experiences that undergird it. And so, understanding how those experiences are functioning, I think, is really helpful for the times we're in, especially since, near-death experiences, for instance, really, they're throughout history. I understand that, but they've become much better known now because we have the technology for people to survive death, and you're an example of that. Peter's an example of that, and it happens all the time, and not everyone who dies on the table or dies in an accident and is brought back has an NDE, but the ones who do, it's pretty powerful. Um, and so, and psychedelic experiences as well can bring people to some of those places. It did for me, and those people are out there, and they are, I believe, uh, a lot of people now are trying to find ways of making meaning of the world and their experience. And so my focus is just how do we make meaning of these extraordinary spiritual experiences? And so I sort of, based on my experience, and then sort of globalizing it or universalizing it a little bit, which is something I used to hate having people do, but I think I've revised that, having done it myself. Um, is there's sort of a pattern to how these things play out, and it's not a progressive pattern. One thing doesn't necessarily lead to another. It functions more like a sphere or a circle, so any part can be active at any point, and the parts do sort of flow into another. And it begins with just where are you when this thing is happening, and what's the set and setting from the psychedelic world. Where are you, who's with you, and as important, I think, is what are the signs and symbols, the histories and the stories of the place where something is happening. Because once you sort of start into this, as you well know, very little is random anymore. You know, there's like a sense that's trying to make itself known through these experiences. And so knowing that background can help us understand what's happening in the experience itself even more. And so then we come into what's showing up, the appearance, and what's, who or what is showing up. It could be a being, a new place. We may be taken to a place in our imagination, or a sort of a other dimension, I guess. And so then we do the work of finding out if there's what's the known meaning we're carrying into what's showing up. And then there's what are those things that are showing up trying to tell us, or what are they actually saying to us? And so that would be the revelation aspect of a extraordinary spiritual experience. And this is where we get like my message about beauty, that's sort of the revelatory part of the experience. And I would just say, not all of these have to happen for it to be an extraordinary spiritual experience. I think these are just the components that comprise making meaning. As you well know, we can have an extraordinary experience and not be able to make meaning of it. It can be very difficult to make meaning. And that's brings us to the fourth aspect, which is disclosure, which is what we tell other people about what we experienced and get the feedback of the community. And I think that's really where true meaning is made, because if I just use my own experience and what I know to apply the meaning to what's happened to me, then I have just this sort of self-enclosed, everything curves in onto me. And that's not really, we can glean some meaning from that, but it's really not meaning in the truest sense, I think. Meaning is meaning is really only meaningful, I guess is the way to say it, when it's shared with others and when others are reflecting back how their experience relates to yours. And that's where true meaning, I think, really begins to blossom. And so anyway, that's sort of the structure as I see it of an extraordinary spiritual experience. And I just, once you see the pattern, you kind of begin to see it everywhere, and so I started seeing the pattern in the Bible. I started reading these crazy stories like the Moth Man story from Pennsylvania. I don't know if you know about that, but it's worth checking out. There's a great book by John Keel about it. And the Mothman story sort of progresses. People start seeing this bat-like creature, human-sized bat-like creature. And along with seeing it, they get this sense of dread in this town in Pennsylvania. And it all leads up to about 3 months later when the bridge collapses between this town and it's a river town between Pennsylvania and Ohio. And the bridge collapsed and like 30 people died in this bridge collapse. And then the Mothman story stopped. But if you go backwards from the event, you hear all these stories and it begins to appear that this is what it's focused on. And so, it's this tragic story, but what I like about thinking about these things, NDEs and psychedelic experiences in terms of an extraordinary spiritual experience, is it encompasses a lot, and it brings in a lot. So that an extraordinary spiritual experience has, it might be psychedelics over here and an NDE here and a UFO encounter over here, and they all have these sort of similar life-changing outcomes. And so, for me, the big outcome from my psychedelic experiences at Johns Hopkins was because of my encounter and my first experience with Gene. I had this very strong sense that a knowing that consciousness remains after death, and that carries on. I'm willing to be convinced that it's not personal after death, but it seems like it is. So, but regardless, it continues on after death, and it changed completely how I walked in to hospitals, to homes where people were dying, and how I talked to people who were dying. And before, I'd be very nervous. I'd be like, oh, what am I going to say? How am I going to, I have to be careful. And all that went away. And all my sort of fear around it went away.
Yes, you're a near-death experiencer. You have that in common with them because we get kind of excited when someone's about to die. I'm like, oh, they're going to the light. Oh, this is so good.
Yeah. And I mean, and I was even asking people, it's been a while, I'll be able to do this again. I have a new job starting up as for a hospice organization as a spiritual and grief counselor. But I would go in and ask people, what are you looking forward to? And who do you hope to see? And what do you think's going to happen? And trying to get them to talk about what their expectations are rather than focusing on, oh my God, what's going to happen? Just kind of, no, what's next on your trip here? And where are we going next? And
it's important to think about what you want because I think love calls it in. That our consciousness does call it in. As someone who has worked as a pastor and now as a grief counselor, what do you say to other pastors who have kind of shut down near-death experiencers or people who've had extraordinary experiences? How would you kind of teach them or guide them to help people integrate, really?
Yeah, I think the first thing I like to think about, I don't know, I guess if I were going to say anything, it's first of all that, you know, people have these experiences and and they take them very seriously. And so our work is not to determine the validity or you know, the our judgment towards that experience is irrelevant. And it's irrelevant to them because you're not taking them seriously. So first of all is just take the experience seriously and listen to what's happening, and uh, and then find out what their interpretation of it is first and foremost before you ever begin your own, regardless of what your faith or religious or spiritual background is. Um, and then, I'm just a big believer in asking questions. And when I say asking questions, it's not towards a goal necessarily. It's to find out what you're genuinely curious about the experience, and ask genuine questions. And I just think that's really, uh, I'm a little unusual. I think I have a weird background. I've been through various spiritual things long, you know, my baptism was a very powerful experience when I was 15 years old. But I've been I lived in a new age commune. I studied Tai Chi. I've done Zen meditation since I was 16, off and on throughout my entire life. I still do Tai Chi and teach it. And so and I've studied world religions. And so I'm just rabidly curious about these things. And I find asking questions far more interesting. And why wouldn't you be? I mean, the Bible is just filled with weird stories. They're so bizarre and strange. Why wouldn't you just sort of revel in that? I mean, you know, a young girl, a young woman being visited by angels, and and uh, you know, talking bushes, talking donkeys. There's talking donkeys. You know, I find it
Like
thoroughly fascinating.
Shrek.
Yeah, I, I mean, and so I'm just unusually curious about these things and people's experience, and I I find it. I use I use those questions and what people say to inform how I understand my faith, rather than flipping it around and trying to tell other people how they should believe these things. It's not, it's not that I don't care. I, what I would say though is I would be unbelievably bored if the afterlife is filled with people who believe the same thing I do. You know, that sounds like hell to me.
Well, I can assure you that people get to continue and learn. They get to read
Yeah.
all of history and know all of history, and
Hmm.
they can go as far as they want with learning. Like some of it
Hmm.
is depending on how brave you are. Like,
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
want to journey to see other cultures that are not human? Do you want to, it's
Hmm.
up to you, I think, as a soul, like where your
Yeah.
curiosity takes you. At least that's what I've been.
Well, good, because I'm all in on that. And you
The
know,
people who like to study get to.
yeah, and the way I like to put it, and this has really sort of become clear to me after my psychedelic experiences. My second experience was challenging in the sense that, I'm quite open, as you've heard, to a lot of different ideas and beliefs, but I know that I've committed to, you know, one God, presenting God's self in three different ways, as they like to say in Christianity, the Trinity. And that's weird too, but that's fine. But I became gods in my journeys. And for a monotheistic religion, I had to do some serious mental work and spiritual work to say, okay, how am I going to understand this and take it seriously? Because clearly, that's an experience, not just that I have had, but historically, billions have had encountering other gods. And so how am I going to resolve that? And so it took some work and thought, and I'm glad I did it. And
How did you
so
interpret those signs and
well,
symbols of
I
your second
yeah,
experience?
I mean, I kind of this is the sort of the, I guess, kind of a non-answer, but it's also not. I mean, in the Old Testament, God, particularly in the early books, the first five, the Torah, it becomes clear that God is the God of gods, you know, and um, and so that's kind of the track I
Mhm.
take, you know. It's not at the expense of those gods, though it can be if it becomes contradictory to, you know, God's will for, the world, whatever, however we want to understand that. But sort of the God of gods is kind of how I
That
took
makes,
it in.
that makes
Yeah.
sense. And maybe
Yeah.
even unconditional love is the God of God. That
Yeah.
that energy of love is the deeper truth, and it comes in
Hmm.
different forms. I know lucid
Yeah.
dreaming is a little bit similar to near-death
Hmm.
experiences and definitely psychedelic trips. Like I
Yeah.
I had several lucid dreams after my NDE because I was in this body cast and I just had,
Oh, geez.
lucid.
Right.
And
I
so
remember I listened to that. Yes, that sounds painful in
Oh,
the heart.
so as I was lucid dreaming, I thought, what would it be like to be Mozart? And so I became Mozart in
Mm,
a sea of colors that was the sunrise. And I really felt like I was him composing Mozart's
mm.
magic. The magic flute was like coming through me and moving through me. And I was like, oh, how creative and fun that must have been to be him. So
Yeah.
I think that's how I interpret your experience of being these gods. You got to see what it was like to be the
Hmm.
embodiment of that consciousness that either people
Hmm.
projected or experienced or was real. Whatever
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was, it was your consciousness merged with it.
Hmm. I like that. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
And I see our consciousness, I see our body as kind of small, and our consciousness is so much more. Because how can you explain telepathy or all the
Hmm.
connects between people all across the world who will know when someone dies or have
Right.
the name of someone
Yeah.
that that's the way we operate in the spirit world. Is things happen very quickly, not in time,
Hmm.
in terms of time. And here,
Yeah.
we are trying to make sense of this world, but there's so much more going on, so much.
Hmm.
And I think near-death
Yeah.
experiences and psychedelics just give us a glimpse of the more.
Yeah. And the other part I like about it is it kind of forces reversals of how we normally think of things. I mean, once you start asking the question after some of these experiences, what is a body? It just gets stranger and stranger, and I don't really have a good answer. What is a body? And a receiver? I think it's a receiver of on multiple levels, and that's kind of how I've begun to understand
Well,
bodies,
yeah,
and
yeah, well, think about animals and how they receive different signals and different inputs.
yeah,
Like they
right,
they experience the world so differently through sound and smells, and they are
yeah,
different receivers than us. But if you look at us, I mean, you said it, the colors were different in your psychedelic.
Hmm.
That's very common for near-death experiencers because our eyes are not limited to our bodies. They're
Right. Yeah.
three-dimensional. They can see in 360, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Very cool.
So if you, I guess we should end this, but if you wanted to leave listeners with a couple of things, there's three or four different types of listeners. One might be the one who doesn't have spiritual experiences too often,
Hmm.
distracted. How might you tell this person to open themselves to more spiritual experiences and see these as real? Others might be afraid of some of these experiences, and then
Hmm.
others might have been shut down by people in churches and not
Yeah.
feel, at home in churches because of their experiences.
Hmm.
So there's
Well,
a range, but anything you want to say?
yeah. I mean, I think in answer to that, the first thing I would say is that, uh, in particular for church, synagogue, I mean, part of my thinking after my experiences is that you don't have to have had the extraordinary spiritual experience. Um, it's as valuable to take seriously the extraordinary spiritual experiences of others, you know, and um, and recognize this sort of the beauty of simplicity, in that, you know, there's the big experience, and then there's the more slow moving, gentle living of life that is its own extraordinary thing, and using those extraordinary experiences to inform your present experience, whether or not you actually have this great insight. I think part of the in the psychedelic community in particular, not so much in the near death community, there's this sort of expectation that everyone should have this and experience this. I just don't think that's necessary, you know, but I do think it is incumbent on the people who have had the experiences to learn how to communicate it well. And by that, I mean not as not in spite of or in contradiction to the lived experience of other people.
Mm.
And so, in that regard, it should be an avenue towards compassion, empathy, as you've said, and just uh, really caring and being loving. And in terms of fear, I get it. I mean, um, I mean, one of the things I came away with, this has lessened considerably over the years, since my experiences. But initially, I had about 2 years where I was sort of um, living in this idea that, just beyond the veil of what we can perceive are beings that have way more influence on us than we'll ever have on them. And I still kind of, think that in some ways. But what are you going to do about it? You know? And I mean, there's only so much you can do. And I think the way out of the influence is again to be radically curious and interested in the lives of other people and what they've experienced, and whether it's true or real. All those questions, I think, are far less important than compassionate listening, and you know letting it inform how you're perceiving your world. I just think. And the last thing I'd say is, as a spiritual leader, my work, I feel like, is to learn how to make space for people to feel comfortable to share those experiences with others. And part of preaching and teaching from scripture is to highlight those extraordinary experiences in such a way that it resonates with other people's lives. So it's not out there away from us. You know, it's easy to project, um, yeah, Jesus out there, and I'm nothing like that. And so, and instead, you know, see all the resonances of what we can become and who we're meant to be, I think. So,
I couldn't agree more. As a class working in classrooms of all ages, from
mhm.
grade to adults, I've been changed by compassionate listening and creating community. That the more people over the years, and it's been thousands at this point, almost like a minister, the more people I've listened to, the more my consciousness has expanded from
Yeah.
them in my heart and wish them well
Mhm.
and just understand a piece of their world. And so I think a lot of our problems of hating one another, polarization could be solved with listening in community to one another
Mhm.
without judgment. Yeah.
I agree. I agree. I think it's really hard right now. And
Yeah.
it's hard for me to see a pathway forward, you know, but I just, from my experiences at Johns Hopkins, I- solving the problem isn't my work. My work is just to be as focused as I can on loving kindness and not letting my mantra over the past few months has been the world doesn't get to win. The world doesn't get to override my commitments to love, beauty, you know,
And
kindness. So,
wonderful. And as I just have to let you know, as we've been doing this interview, all this beautiful, like white dust pollen has been flowing past the window, looking at my Buddha and my beautiful rosemary
oh,
plant.
that's nice. Yeah.
And it's been a very beautiful conversation. So thank you, Seth.
Yeah, thank you. This has been great.